So let me talk about now in the last few minutes some network analysis that's going on in Africa and some case examples. And I do this in a way that's quite exciting because some of the very earliest work on social networks that was done by Clyde Mitchell and others, in fact, Jeremy Boissevin, others, was done in Africa or in very rural areas, sometimes in islands off the coast of Europe and other areas in Africa and South Asia. And one of the things that everybody was motivated by was understanding the ways in which networks explained social relationships, rather than relying on traditional kind of stereotypes of what family should do. Like, this is what a father should do. This is what a mother should do. You know, my oldest brother is the one who's in charge of a funeral or a wedding or whatever. So instead of making those assumptions, they actually just looked to see. So what I'm going to talk about now is show you, first of all, some of the data that were done in the original overview, that the relationship between social networks and health is nearly universal. It's not something that's contained to only European or Western countries. These are the odds ratios between social networks and self-rated health in sub-Saharan Africa, and you see they range from just above 1 or 1 all the way up to like 2 or 3 in these examples. You see the same kind of things in South Asia and Oceania. If you look at the risks in Bangladesh and Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, Australia, Afghanistan, New Zealand, you see these same kinds of patterns. And you see them in East Asia and the Pacific, again, going all the way up to about 3. And these are, of course, the relationships that where research has been concentrated, looking at high-income countries in the OECD. So let me talk a little bit about one very, very exciting study that's done in Malawi. And I do it to illustrate the kind of intense work that people can do on social networks and the kind of information that's likely to come out of these studies, even though they're in their very earliest stages. This is a study that's done by Hellerinker and Hans-Peter Kohler, mostly from University of Pennsylvania, and they have done a collaborative study with a set of colleagues in Likoma. So Likoma is an island in Malawi, and what they were interested in was studying the sexual networks that connected young adults together. And in this case, studying everybody on a small island gives you a very important perspective. So Likoma Island is located in Lake Malawi and has a population of about 7,000, living in about 12 villages. And as I said, it was chosen because it was a very contained, well-defined, geographically constrained population with limited mobility. So you could really get a sense of what the networks were. And they are in a series of phases of collecting data. First was just to do a census of the area and then to do an in-depth sexual network and health survey among young adults, and then to collect biomarkers. So the arrow shows actually where Likoma Island is in Malawi. And this is what the Likoma Island study looks like. What you see in the dark are the number of villages going around that were sampled, so they didn't sample all the villages. The dark colors represent the villages that were studied quite carefully and what HIV testing was done in these areas. In general, HIV testing was done in a range from about 82% or 86% of the population to a low of about 50, sort of mid-50s. And survey participation was quite good, ranging from the 80s to the 90s. So great study. And this is just to give you a sense of the age distribution and the household listing. So a lot of very young people in the study. And this is important because it shows the beginning of how social network studies get done. So in the beginning, there were 1,858 reports of sexual relationships when they did the original surveys. 1,200, or about 70% of those relationships, were with partners in lymphoma. So they were partnered relationships with people in the same area. 550 were with partners outside of lymphoma. So if we just follow, for an instance, the ones who were in lymphoma, 216 were not linked to household migration rosters, but over 1,000 were linked. And they have, in the end, 845 reports between respondents and 223 reports in other villages of lymphoma. So from this, you start to see the network of sexual relationships. So this is a network, a sexual network. It's not just a network of friends and relatives, it's a network of sexual ties. And in this way, you can understand really well how sexually transmitted diseases become transmitted and what are the network characteristics. So this is just a slide that shows the percentage of people who are in and out of the sample for men and women, showing that it's pretty similar. And here is an interesting slide that shows the relationships reported by men and women here. And the bottom dark part of this represents marital relationships. The next one to the right is stable but non-marital relationships. The next area in the lighter color is infrequent non-marital relationships, and the last one is one-night stands. So this shows you the distribution of sexual relationships for men and women. And what you can see is that if you look at the differences between men and women, probably the most striking thing is that men have more stable non-marital relationships than women do, and slightly fewer marital relationships. But you only learn this when you start to do network analysis. And then now comes the clever part. So this is a network of all the relationships that were ever active during 3 years before the survey. So each of these people on the left is a line, and a dotted line represents a tie to that person, and then the darker lines start to represent contacts that go several ways between people who either had sex with several people in the network or actually formed a closed network. And in this way, you can start to map out the transmission of disease and actually understand how to break these patterns. This is a really other cool slide of all sexual relationships that were active within 1 year before the survey. And what you see is that there's a huge closed network where if one of these people had sex with somebody else and they had a sexually transmitted disease, whether it was HIV or another one, the odds of other people in the network getting it were huge, right? Because all it takes is one person having sex with one person and that person having sex with somebody else. And in a closed network, you start to see this loop and circle where the transmission of disease becomes very active. And all the other ones that you see are very small networks where people had sex with one or two people, but they weren't linked to this larger network. And this is what it looked like at the time of the survey. Again, a very dense network where lots of people had sex with one or two people in a very closed network, and then a series of much more disconnected sorts of things. So this turns out to be terribly important for anything that we think about prevention, because it says that people in this dense network are very highly likely to get a sexually transmitted disease in this case, even if they are completely with one partner. Because if their partner has sex with one other person, never mind several people, just one other person, they can be exposed to this whole ring of exposure. So this is another study, but done by the same team, that illustrates the kind of work that you can think of. So this is social network analysis using longitudinal data on HIV/AIDS from rural Malawi. And this is talking about the diffusion of people's sense of risk and attitudinal change related to family planning and HIV/AIDS. So here, this is a very good example of what a network looks like. The person at the bottom is a respondent, and that's the person who, say, is in the study. And this is the people that he or she knows. And if we ask each of those people what are their attitudes towards family planning, what are their attitudes towards multiple partners, anything like that, you can start to understand how the spread of both attitudes and transmission for a sexually transmitted disease might happen. And this actually just shows the results, which suggests, this is a hard slide to see, but it just suggests that once networks become quite dense, that is, people know each other, the proportion of network partners that are highly worried about AIDS starts to increase a lot. So the diffusion of information, as well as the diffusion of disease, can be patterned by the structure of social relationships. And this is just an example of the kind of work that people might do in terms of prevention. So this is a book that's written by Tom Valente, who's done a lot of work on prevention of disease using network approaches and what it would take. And the slide on the other side shows networks of HIV-positive patients in which at least one other person was enrolled in an HIV vaccine preparedness studies. So you can see that it only takes a few people potentially to influence networks, even in the case where, in this case, none of these networks are actually clustered together. They're like series of lots of independent networks. Let me just skip over this. And finally, you can see that there are lots of data on contraceptive use. This is another study done by Valente looking at contraceptive use among Cameroonian women. And again, we see that the relationship between networks and contraceptive use and attitudes towards contraceptive use is highly patterned by social networks. And using social networks to design interventions, this is a set of pictures out of the book by Valente, in which you could imagine, here are all networks, they're different colors kind of representing different networks, that if you had an intervention, you could just decide to do the intervention in one or two key people within each network. And they would then diffuse that information out. So if you were doing a network intervention, you wouldn't just randomly pick people. You would pick people who were center of the network, and you would want to make sure that you hit multiple networks. So this just shows the ways in which you can use information from social networks actually to maximize the impact of different kinds of interventions. And this is another slide that just shows the way in which network segmentation can influence the induction of different kinds of patterns of behavior change. And this is a set of references, and we will end it there. Thank you very much. I hope you look at these papers. It's a lot to take in one session, but it's an enormously big field and very exciting. Thanks a lot.